The Forbidden Feast. Ethan sat at the long, stone table, his eyes scanning the grand feast before him. The smell of roasted meats and exotic spices filled the air, making his stomach growl. He was the only human among the Sothar, a warrior race known for their brutal strength and battle-hardened traditions. The Sothar chieftain, Gorvak, sat at the head of the table, his golden armor reflecting the glow of the torches. His piercing yellow eyes watched Ethan closely. Around them, dozens of warriors feasted loudly, ripping into chunks of alien meat and drinking from massive stone goblets. Ethan had been invited to this feast as an honored guest, or so he thought. A massive platter was placed in front of him, filled with steaming red meat, unlike anything he had ever seen. It looked like a delicacy, glistening with juices, sending a tempting aroma into the air. His mouth watered. Beside him, a female Sothar warrior, Ratal, leaned in and whispered, "Eat wisely, human. Some dishes are not meant for outsiders." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why? Is it poisonous?" Ratal smirked. "Worse." Before he could ask more, Gorvak spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "Eat, human. Show us your strength." The entire hall fell silent. Warriors turned their heads to watch. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but something felt off. Then his stomach reminded him how hungry he was. He picked up a piece of the red meat and took a bite. The moment the flesh touched his tongue, a strange warmth spread through his body. The flavor was intense, rich, powerful, almost electric. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He chewed slowly, savoring it, unaware that every Sothar warrior in the room was staring at him in shock. The silence was thick. Then, Gorvak stood up, his expression dark. He pointed at Ethan with a heavy clawed finger. "You have eaten the flesh of challenge," he said. Ethan froze, still chewing. What?" Ratal let out a sharp breath. "You fool." Gorvak's voice boomed through the hall. "By our law, anyone who eats the flesh of challenge must prove their strength in combat." The warriors pounded their fists on the table, their eyes gleaming with excitement. Some cheered, others growled. Ethan could feel the tension in the air. They wanted blood. He swallowed hard, his appetite completely gone. "Wait, that's a joke, right?" Gorvak stepped forward, towering over him. "You are human, weak, unworthy, and yet you have taken a bite of our sacred test. You must now face the trials, or die where you stand." Ethan's heart pounded. He was an explorer, a diplomat, not a warrior. He had seen Sothar warriors fight before. They were brutal, unstoppable. If he had to go against them, he didn't stand a chance. A massive warrior, covered in scars, grinned and pounded his chest. "Let me fight him, chieftain. I will break him in one strike." Another warrior laughed. "No, let him run the gauntlet. If he survives, then we will see if he is worthy." More warriors shouted their agreement. Ethan raised his hands. "Hold on, let's talk about this." Gorvak ignored him. He turned to the crowd. "The human has accepted the challenge." "I did not," Ethan protested. The warriors cheered, slamming their fists against the table, the sound like thunder. Ethan clenched his fists. This was insane. He had come here expecting a friendly meal, maybe some negotiations. Now he was about to be thrown into some kind of deadly test. Ratal sighed beside him. "You should have listened, human." Ethan took a slow breath. His mind raced. He needed a plan. Running wasn't an option. Neither was fighting brute strength with brute strength. If he wanted to survive, he would have to think differently. Gorvak raised his arms. At dawn, the trials begin. The crowd roared. Ethan, sitting in the center of it all, felt his stomach drop. One bite. That was all it took. Now he had to prove his strength in ways he never expected, or die trying. The first trial, the gauntlet. The first rays of dawn barely touched the jagged cliffs of Zhurkar, the Sothar homeworld, when the warriors led Ethan to the trial grounds. The air was thick with heat, carrying the distant roars of alien creatures and the rhythmic clang of metal as warriors sharpened their weapons. Ethan's wrists were still sore from the iron shackles they had placed on him the night before, not as a prisoner, but as a challenger. He had barely slept, haunted by the thought of what awaited him. The gauntlet. Ratel, the only Xothar who seemed remotely interested in his survival, walked beside him. "You should have run when you had the chance," she muttered. Ethan smirked despite the knot in his stomach. "And go where? I don't think your people would have let me get far." Ratel let out a deep chuckle. "No, you would have been hunted like prey." Not the most comforting thought. They arrived at the arena, a massive circular pit carved into the rocky ground. The stands above were already filled with warriors, chanting and stomping their boots. The air vibrated with their excitement. Ethan looked up at the center platform where Chieftain Gorvak stood, his arms crossed. His golden armor gleamed under the morning sun. "Human," the chieftain's voice thundered across the arena. "You have taken the flesh of challenge, and now you must prove your worth. The gauntlet is your first trial. Survive, and you may earn your right to fight as a warrior." Ethan swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" A massive warrior beside him grinned, showing rows of sharp teeth. "Then we feed your bones to the scavengers." Fantastic. The arena floor trembled, and suddenly, massive stone gates slid open. Ethan watched as sharp-edged obstacles, swinging axes, collapsing platforms, and spiked walls emerged from the ground, forming a deadly maze of death traps. He exhaled sharply. So that's the gauntlet. Gorvak raised his hand, signaling the start. Survive, or die. The moment his hand dropped, a loud horn blared, and Ethan's body moved before his brain could catch up. The gauntlet begins. Ethan sprinted forward, his boots kicking up dust. The first obstacle, a row of massive spinning blades, stood ahead. The Xothar warriors watching from the stands cheered as he approached, expecting him to get torn apart. But Ethan wasn't like them. Instead of charging through like a berserker, he studied the pattern of the blades. 3 seconds between each swing. He timed his steps and dove forward, rolling just as a blade sliced the air where his head had been. The crowd's roar changed, less laughter, more surprise. The next section was worse, falling stone pillars designed to crush anything underneath. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched massive stone slabs slam down in rapid sequences. He took a deep breath. The Xothar relied on brute strength to push through these, but Ethan wasn't a brute. He had something else, speed and intelligence. Instead of trying to dodge each pillar, he ran alongside them, using their impact timing to predict the next safe space. He zigzagged through the deadly path, narrowly avoiding being flattened. He heard gasps from the crowd. The Xothar didn't expect this. The pit of death. Ethan barely had time to breathe before he reached the next trial. A long pit of spikes, too wide to jump across. A thick rope bridge stretched over it, swaying dangerously in the wind. A growl made him freeze. At the far end of the bridge stood a Xothar beasthound, its yellow eyes glowing. It was massive, its muscles coiled and ready to strike. The beast was clearly meant to be an extra obstacle, something to force him into rushing across the bridge in panic. Ethan gritted his teeth. If he ran blindly, the beast would catch him in seconds. If he hesitated, it would lunge. Instead of fear, he let strategy take over. He grabbed a handful of dust from the ground and hurled it at the beast's face. The creature snarled, shaking its head in confusion. Ethan used the moment to dash forward, moving quickly but not running, keeping his center of gravity low so the swaying bridge wouldn't throw him off balance. The beast recovered and charged, too late. Ethan was already on the other side. More gasps from the crowd, more murmurs. The human was not like them. The final climb. The last section of the gauntlet was a vertical wall, nearly 20 feet high, with nothing but jagged, uneven handholds. Sothar warriors, with their raw strength, would climb this with ease. Ethan? Not so much. But he had something they didn't: agility and a sharp mind. He ran toward the wall at full speed, then leaped, catching the lowest ledge. His arms screamed in protest, but he forced himself up, using momentum instead of raw muscle. Instead of pulling his way up like a Sothar, he used a parkour technique, swinging from ledge to ledge, keeping his movements fluid. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were silent, watching. Gorvak's expression was unreadable. With a final pull, Ethan threw himself over the top edge and rolled onto the solid ground. The impossible victory. He had done it. He had survived the gauntlet. Ethan lay on his back, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. The cheers from the crowd were not of mockery anymore, but of shock and grudging respect. He sat up, looking at the chieftain, who watched him with narrowed eyes. Finally, Gorvak spoke. "You survived," he admitted. Ethan pushed himself up, his legs shaking. "Told you I'd make it." The chieftain's gaze was cold. The first trial was for the unworthy. The next will truly test if you belong here. Ethan exhaled sharply, a smirk forming despite himself. Bring it on. The beast pit, fight or die. The Sothar warriors roared with excitement as Ethan was dragged toward the beast pit. His muscles still burned from the gauntlet, his breath heavy, but there was no time to recover. The first trial had tested his endurance. Now they wanted to see if he could fight. The beast pit was legendary among the Sothar. It was where the weak perished, and the strong proved their right to exist. The ground trembled as the heavy iron gates opened, revealing a circular, blood-stained arena surrounded by jagged stone walls. The sky above was a dull shade of red, the light filtering through the dust-filled air. Ethan stood in the center, his hands clenched into fists. No weapons, no armor. Just him and whatever nightmare they were about to throw at him. From above, Chieftain Gorvak watched, his golden armor gleaming under the sunlight. You survived the gauntlet, human. But strength is not just speed. It is the power to dominate, to kill. A deep metallic rumbling echoed through the arena. A massive reinforced gate slid open on the far side of the pit. Dust and sand billowed into the air as a monstrous shadow emerged. Then came the roar, so deep and primal it made the stone beneath Ethan's feet vibrate. The Varnak, a monster unlike any other. The Varnak was a hulking beast, nearly twice the size of an elephant, covered in thick, plated scales that shimmered like obsidian. Its 6 crimson eyes locked onto Ethan, pupils narrowing as it took in its prey. Its 4 muscular limbs dug into the earth, claws long enough to carve through solid rock. A spiked tail whipped behind it, capable of shattering bones with a single strike. The warriors chanted its name, slamming their fists against their chests. Varanoka, Varanoka, Varanoka. Ethan exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a fight. It was an execution. Gorvak's voice boomed across the pit. Face the beast, human. Kill it, or let it kill you. The Varnak charge. The first attack. Death comes fast. Ethan barely had time to react before the beast was on him. It moved impossibly fast for something its size, closing the distance in a single bound. He threw himself to the side just as a massive clawed foot slammed into the ground where he had been standing. The impact sent shockwaves through the arena, throwing up dust and shattered rock. Ethan rolled to his feet, chest heaving. He couldn't fight this thing head-on. It was too strong, too armored. A frontal assault was suicide. The Varnak turned, its 6 eyes glowing with hungry malice. It lunged again, swiping with a razor-sharp claw. This time, Ethan ducked and ran toward it instead of away. The beast wasn't expecting that. Its attack missed as Ethan slid underneath its massive frame, barely avoiding the crushing weight of its body. Finding the weakness, the human way. As he rolled to his feet, Ethan's mind raced. The Sothar were warriors, but they relied on brute strength. That's why they fought the Varnock head-on, trying to overpower it. Ethan couldn't do that, but he could outthink it. He scanned the beast's body, scales too thick for punches or kicks, claws too fast to dodge forever, tail too deadly to get behind. Then he saw it, a small patch of soft, unarmored flesh beneath its jaw. It wasn't much, but it was a weakness. Now he just had to survive long enough to use it. The strategy: turning the beast against itself. The Varnock roared in frustration, its prey still standing. It charged again, this time faster. Ethan ran. Not away, but toward the stone walls. The beast pursued, its massive feet shaking the ground with each step. Ethan reached the arena wall and leaped, grabbing onto an outcropping of jagged rock. He pulled himself up just as the Varnock slammed into the wall at full speed. The impact shook the entire pit. The beast snarled in rage, momentarily stunned. The crowd gasped. The human was using the environment against the monster. Ethan didn't hesitate. He leaped onto the beast's back, grabbing hold of the thick ridges of its armored spine. The Varnock let out a deafening howl and began thrashing violently, trying to shake him off. Ethan climbed, using its own wild movements to propel himself toward its head. The beast reared back, slamming against the stone walls, trying to crush him, but Ethan was already in position. With one final push, he reached the unarmored spot beneath its jaw. Now or never. The killing blow. The warrior's choice. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan drove his fist into the Varnock's weak spot. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through the beast's body. It let out a horrifying scream, stumbling backward. Ethan hit it again. And again. Blood poured from the wound. The Varnock's movements slowed, its massive limbs trembling. With a final shudder, it collapsed, its heavy frame crashing into the ground. Silence. Then, an eruption of cheers. The warriors who had mocked him now roared in shock and respect. Ethan staggered to his feet, his body aching, his breath ragged. He looked up at Gorvac. The chieftain's expression was unreadable, his piercing yellow eyes locked onto Ethan. Finally, Gorvac spoke. "You fight like no warrior I have ever seen," he said. His voice was not angry, nor mocking. It was something else. Curiosity. Ethan wiped blood from his lip. "I'm not a warrior," he said. "I'm a survivor." Gorvac's lips curled into a slight smirk. Perhaps that is the same thing. The crowd cheered his name. For the first time, they saw the human not as prey, but as something more. But Ethan knew this was far from over. The next trial awaited. And this time, it would be against a Sothar warrior. The duel of honor. The Sothar warriors still roared from the victory Ethan had claimed in the beast pit, but he barely heard them. His body ached, every muscle screaming in exhaustion, but there was no time to recover. The Varnock was dead, its massive corpse still bleeding onto the arena floor. The scent of iron and dust filled the air. Ethan had proven he could survive, but the real challenge was just beginning. Above him, Chieftain Gorvac stood, his golden armor glowing in the blood-red sunlight. His eyes held no amusement, only cold calculation. "You killed the beast," Gorvac said, his voice carrying through the arena. "But a beast does not make you a warrior." The crowd silenced. Gorvac raised his clawed hand and pointed toward the opposite side of the pit. "To be honored among the Sothar, you must face a true opponent. One of us." A tremor of excitement rippled through the warriors. Then, from the shadows of the arena, a towering Sothar warrior stepped forward. Commander Ruthless. The crowd exploded into cheers, stomping their feet in rhythm. "Rhas, Zul, Rha, Zul, Rha, Zul." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had heard that name before. Ruthless, the only Sothar who had warned him earlier, leaned in and whispered, "You're already dead." Ethan forced a smirk. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." The opponent, the undefeated warrior. Ruthless was a mountain of muscle, his body covered in thick scars from countless battles. His crimson eyes glowed with calculated brutality, and unlike the other warriors, he did not cheer, did not show excitement, only quiet, controlled menace. He carried no weapons. He didn't need them. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps, his massive boots leaving deep imprints in the sand. Ethan was half his size. That Sother did not believe in mercy. The duel was not to submission. It was to the death. Gorvak raised his hands. This is the duel of honor. Let there be no deceit, no cowardice, only strength. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't win with brute force. That much was obvious. But brute force wasn't the only way to win. The horn blared. The fight began. The first attack, a lesson in pain. Razul moved like lightning. Ethan barely had time to react before a massive fist slammed into his gut, sending him flying backward. He hit the ground hard, the impact stealing the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through his ribs. The crowd laughed. Pathetic, Razul growled, stepping forward. You should have stayed a spectator. Ethan coughed, forcing himself to his feet. His stomach felt like it had been hit by a battering ram. Razul wasn't just strong. He was fast. Ethan clenched his fists. He needed a new plan. Adapting to the fight. A different kind of strength. Razul charged again. But this time, Ethan didn't try to block. He dodged. The massive warrior's punch whistled through the air, missing Ethan by inches. The force of it sent dust flying. Razul frowned. The human was learning. Ethan kept moving, circling his opponent, forcing him to chase. Razul swung again, a downward strike meant to crush Ethan's skull. But Ethan sidestepped at the last second, making Razul's fist slam into the hard stone floor. The impact cracked the ground, sending a shockwave through the pit. The crowd murmured. Ethan smirked. Big guy, but slow. Razul's expression darkened. Enough games, he growled. The shift. Intelligence over strength. Ethan knew he couldn't beat Razul by trading blows, so he had to make him exhaust himself. For the next few minutes he dodged, rolled, evaded. Every strike Razul threw was a wasted effort, his energy bleeding away. The crowd stopped laughing. This was not how Sother fought. They faced their opponents head-on, relying on raw power. Ethan was changing the fight. Razul's breathing grew heavier. Ethan saw his chance. The final move. A human victory. Razul charged, his fury blinding him. Ethan stepped forward at the last second, twisting his body, using Razul's own momentum against him. With a sharp sidestep, he planted his foot behind Razul's knee, sending the massive warrior crashing forward. Before Razul could react, Ethan moved with precision, grabbing his arm and twisting it into a brutal joint lock. The Xothar warriors gasped. No one had ever subdued Razul like this. Razul growled in frustration, struggling to break free. But Ethan had leverage, not strength. Ethan leaned close, breathing heavily. Yield. For a long moment, Razul resisted. His pride demanded he keep fighting. But then he laughed. A deep, rumbling laugh that echoed through the pit. With a sharp exhale, he slammed his free hand against the ground. Yielding. The arena fell silent. Ethan released him, stepping back. Razul slowly rose to his feet, rolling his massive shoulders. He looked down at Ethan, then nodded. You fight, like no warrior I have ever known, he admitted. Ethan smirked, his heart still hammering. That's because I'm not a warrior. I just don't like dying. The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in respect. Gorvak's expression was unreadable, but his eyes had changed. For the first time, he saw the human as something more than an outsider. But Ethan knew the real test was yet to come. Because in the shadows of the arena, unseen by all, a plot against him had already begun. Betrayal and the real challenge. The celebration of Ethan's victory was short-lived. Despite his narrow, hard-fought success in the duel of honor, the weight of survival pressed heavily on his mind. The Xothar warriors now regarded him with a strange mix of curiosity and respect, but beneath their cheers and chants, he could sense an undercurrent of tension. Ethan wasn't one of them. He hadn't earned their trust, just their attention. He spent the night in a simple stone chamber set apart from the main warrior barracks. The room was sparse. No furniture except a low stone slab for a bed and a single torch that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Every creak, every distant sound of footsteps made his pulse quicken. He'd been through 2 trials and lived, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As he lay on the cold slab, staring at the uneven stone ceiling, Ruthless entered without warning. Her towering form filled the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the crimson glow of the Xothar moons. Ethan sat up, weary but alert. "What now?" he asked. "Another trial." Ruthless hesitated, her usually fierce expression softened by something that looked like concern. "No trial yet, but you need to leave. Tonight." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "I'm still in this fight. I'm surviving." Her gaze hardened. "You don't understand. Gorvak never intended for you to succeed. The trials weren't about proving strength. They were about proving you don't belong here. If you keep winning, you'll make him look weak." Ethan swung his legs off the stone slab, rubbing his temple. "You think he'll rig the next trial? Stack the deck." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He doesn't need to. The 3rd trial is a battle against him, the final right. He never loses." The weight of her words settled on Ethan like a lead blanket. "So what are you saying? I run now, like a coward?" Her expression darkened. "You're not a coward if you run to survive." Ethan shook his head. "If I run, they'll hunt me. I'll be looking over my shoulder forever. And it won't just be me. They'll make sure no human ever sets foot here again." Ruthless crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't owe them anything. Gorvak's pride is too strong. He'll kill you tomorrow, and it will mean nothing to him. But if you leave tonight, you'll have a chance to warn others. To live." Ethan thought about her words. Leaving now would be the logical choice. Live to fight another day. Regroup. Find allies. But something inside him refused to back down. "I'm not running," he said finally. "If Gorvak wants a fight, I'll give him one. And if I go down, I'll make sure everyone sees it." Ruthless's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "You're stubborn. I hope it doesn't get you killed." She turned and left without another word, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. As the first rays of dawn spilled over the jagged mountains, Ethan was led out to the central arena once more. The crowd was larger than before, and the atmosphere was different. Charge, electric. The Xothar warriors lined the stands, their cheers thunderous, their fists pounding against the stone walls. In the center of it all stood Gorvak, his golden armor gleaming, his face a mask of calm authority. He held no weapon, but his presence alone was enough to send a chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan was marched to the opposite side of the arena. The sunlight felt harsh against his face, and the dry air burned his throat. His muscles ached from the previous trials, and his mind was clouded with doubt. Gorvak raised a hand, and the crowd instantly silenced. "This is the final trial," he declared, his deep voice carrying across the arena. "The human has defied the odds. He has survived where none thought he could. But strength must be proven not just against beasts and lesser warriors. It must be proven against me." The crowd erupted in cheers once more. Ethan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This was it. The final challenge. The fight that would determine whether he lived or died. Gorvak stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at Ethan with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You've shown cunning," he said. "Survival instincts. But clever tricks will not save you here. Only strength." Ethan smirked, though his nerves were screaming. "Funny. I thought I've proven plenty of strength already." Gorvak's golden eyes narrowed. You've proven that you can survive, that you can adapt. But to stand among the Sothar, you must be more than a survivor. You must be a conqueror. Only then will you earn honor. The chieftain stepped closer, towering over Ethan, his armor gleaming like the sun itself. Today we fight. And by day's end, there will be no doubt about who is strongest. Ethan felt the weight of the arena's gaze, the pressure of Gorvak's challenge, the reality of what was coming. But he also felt something else. Resolve. I didn't come here to conquer, Ethan said quietly. I came to survive. But if standing against you means showing them that strength isn't just about brute force, then fine. Let's end this. Gorvak's lips curled into a predatory smile. Then you accept your fate. The horns blared, the crowd roared, and the final challenge began. The final rite, strength redefined. The sun burned high above the jagged peaks of the Sothar homeworld, casting long shadows over the ancient combat maze known as the final rite. Ethan stood at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest as the massive stone gates rumbled shut behind him. This wasn't an ordinary fight. It was a test of will, wits, and endurance, the ultimate trial to determine who was truly worthy of standing among the Sothar. The maze stretched before him, a labyrinth of towering walls and deadly traps. It had been designed not just to test physical strength, but to break the spirit. It was said that no warrior could complete the maze without tapping into their deepest reserves of resolve. Gorvak himself had triumphed here decades ago, earning the title of chieftain. But Ethan wasn't a Sothar warrior. He wasn't even supposed to be here. From high above, the crowd's chants echoed across the arena's natural amphitheater. Sothar warriors and onlookers filled the stands, their voices a rhythmic rumble that grew louder with every moment. At the maze's far end, standing atop a raised platform, was Gorvak. His golden armor gleamed in the harsh sunlight, and his piercing yellow eyes locked onto Ethan's from across the distance. This is your final test, human. Gorvak's voice boomed over the roaring crowd. Here, strength alone will not suffice. Only those with the mind, body, and spirit to overcome every challenge can claim victory. Show us what you are truly made of, or perish in the attempt. Ethan exhaled sharply, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scraped, and still trembling slightly from the previous trials. He was exhausted, battered, but not broken. He had survived this long, outwitting beasts and warriors alike. Now he just had to do it again. The horn sounded, a deep, resonant blast that signaled the beginning of the rite. The crowd's cheers grew deafening, but Ethan forced himself to focus. The maze ahead wasn't just stone walls and traps. It was an elaborate puzzle designed to push even the strongest warriors to their limits. He couldn't afford a single mistake. The first passage, blades and shadows. Ethan sprinted forward, entering the maze's first passageway. The air immediately grew cooler as the towering walls blocked out the sun. The sound of the crowd faded, replaced by the eerie echoes of his own footsteps. Ahead, he saw the first obstacle, a series of massive spinning blades, each one glinting with a razor-sharp edge. They swung in complex, overlapping patterns, their rhythm shifting unpredictably. A single misstep would mean instant death. He stopped just short of the first blade, studying its movements. The Sothar were known to charge through these traps, relying on sheer endurance and armor to survive. But Ethan didn't have armor, or the strength to take a glancing blow. Instead, he crouched low, watching the pattern carefully. He noticed a small pause, a fraction of a second where the blades aligned just enough to create a narrow path. Timing was everything. He took a deep breath, then darted forward. 1 step. 2. Duck. Jump. He felt the rush of air as a blade missed his head by inches. His pulse raced, but he kept moving. Behind him, a blade slammed into the stone wall, shattering rock and sending debris flying. He didn't look back. As he cleared the last spinning blade, he stumbled forward into the next section of the maze. The sound of the blades receded, and he allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath. No mistakes, no hesitation. The second passage, the shifting floor. The next chamber was a wide, open corridor with a floor made of interlocking stone tiles. Something about it felt off. Ethan slowed his pace, scanning the area. As he stepped onto the first tile, he heard a faint click. The floor shifted beneath his feet, tilting dangerously. He jumped back just as the tile collapsed into a deep pit, revealing jagged spikes below. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. The tiles moved in unpredictable patterns, some collapsing, others tilting at odd angles. He couldn't rely on brute strength to smash his way through. This was about precision and quick reflexes. Ethan crouched low and began testing the tiles carefully, finding a pattern in their shifting movements. He moved deliberately, keeping his weight balanced and his eyes on the ground. Every step had to count. Several times he felt the ground lurch beneath him, but he shifted his weight just in time, using his outstretched hands for balance. His heart pounded as he reached the end of the corridor, sweat dripping into his eyes. The final passage. The chieftain's gaze. Ethan emerged into the final chamber of the maze. Gorvak stood at the center, waiting. The towering Sothar chieftain seemed utterly at ease, his golden armor immaculate, his arms crossed as if he were observing a casual sparring match. But this was no sparring match. The crowd's chants grew louder, their voices filling the air. They didn't cheer for Ethan. They cheered for Gorvak. "This is where your journey ends," Gorvak said, his voice calm but cold. "You have proven resourceful, human. But I remain the final test. Show me if your strength is more than a trick." Ethan's legs felt like lead, his arms heavy, his lungs burning from the effort of the maze. But he straightened, meeting Gorvak's gaze. This was not just a fight of strength. It was a battle of will. Gorvak stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the stone floor. Ethan raised his fists, the ache in his muscles screaming at him to stop. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The new legend of strength. The arena fell silent as the dust settled. Ethan stood in the center of the maze's final chamber, his chest heaving and his body trembling from exhaustion. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he remained upright, meeting the intense gaze of Chieftain Gorvak. The two were alone now. Their battle settled, yet the weight of the moment hung in the air. The crowd above had changed. What had once been mocking laughter and jeers had turned into a reverent, hushed murmur. The Sothar warriors, some of the fiercest beings in the galaxy, watched the human who had walked into their trials and emerged standing. The human who had defeated their greatest challenges and survived. Gorvak slowly rose to his full height, his golden armor battered and streaked with dirt, yet still radiating power. His piercing yellow eyes locked onto Ethan's, searching for something unspoken. "You should be dead," Gorvak said finally, his voice low and steady. Ethan, still struggling to catch his breath, managed a faint smirk. "Sorry to disappoint." The chieftain's lips twitched, just the barest hint of a smile, quickly masked by his usual stoic expression. He stepped closer to Ethan, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the smaller human. "For generations, strength has meant one thing to us," Gorvak said, his voice carrying to the stands above. "It meant power. It meant dominance. It meant the ability to crush one's enemy without hesitation." He paused, looking out over the gathered warriors. And yet, this human has survived not by brute force, but by strategy, resilience, and courage. The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder. Ethan stood in silence, his mind racing. He had come here expecting death, yet somehow he had done the impossible. "Strength," Gorvak continued, "is not just muscle. It is not just brawn. Strength is the ability to adapt, to think, to endure when the odds are stacked against you. Strength is knowing when to strike and when to stand your ground." He turned back to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "And you, human, you have shown us that strength is not what we thought it was." Ethan raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure where the chieftain was going with this. The pain in his ribs reminded him that he was still mortal, still one misstep away from disaster. Gorvak stepped back, raising his arms to address the crowd. Let it be known across all worlds that this human, Ethan, he hesitated, the name unfamiliar on his tongue, has proven himself worthy. From this day forward, weak Sothar will remember that strength comes in many forms, that even those we once deemed weak may teach us new ways to endure and to prevail. The arena erupted in a thunderous roar. Warriors pounded their fists on their armor, shouting Ethan's name, no longer as a mockery, but as a chant of respect. Ethan blinked in surprise. He had expected to be jeered, perhaps even executed after the trials, but instead he found himself at the center of a warrior culture that was beginning to shift. Ratal appeared beside him, her expression unreadable. "You did it, human." "Yeah," Ethan muttered, his voice still hoarse from the exertion. "I guess I did." Gorvak lowered his arms and turned back to Ethan, his golden eyes steady. "You have earned something greater than survival," he said. "You have earned honor. And you have shown us that strength can mean more than we ever thought." Ethan nodded, a flicker of a smile crossing his lips, and all it took was, what 3 near-death experiences? The chieftain's lips quirked into a faint grin. "And the willingness to challenge everything we believe." As the crowd's cheers echoed in the air, Ethan glanced upward, the red sun casting long shadows across the arena floor. He wasn't sure what came next, what place he would hold among these warriors, or what new challenges awaited him. But one thing was certain: he had changed their world as much as they had changed his. The human stood tall among the Sothar. A new legend of strength had been born.